November's episode of the Stanford AIMI Happy Hour. I'm your host this evening. I'm Dr. Hugh Harvey, streaming live from the UK. And tonight our theme is AI on a global scale. So we've got representatives from around the world in various different time zones. I don't know how we've managed to coordinate the timing so well, but we've got people awake all the way around the world. So we've got Brazil, Australia, UK, the USA, India, and perhaps someone from Canada joining us at the last minute, but that is yet to be confirmed. I'm going to go through the guests one by one, but we will go, as is custom, with ladies first. Introducing Karley Yoder, who works at GE. Tell the world about yourself, Karley.
Yeah, Hugh and Amy, thanks for having me on. My name's Karley. I'm the General Manager for Artificial Intelligence at GE Healthcare. I have the pleasure of partnering with some of the folks on this panel as we look to build AI and then embed it across the various device and solution product offerings that GE is bringing to market. And more focusing on startup ecosystem and partnerships there in the AI space. So really eager to have this conversation today and learn from some of the minds that I obsessively follow and learn from already. So it's great to be on here. Thanks, Hugh.
Well, thank you, Karley, for coming. Next, another new face, all the way from Brazil, Dr. Eduardo Reis. Do you want to introduce yourself, Eduardo?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I'm Eduardo. I'm a radiologist. And as part of my training, I did clinical informatics too. So now I work at Albert Einstein Hospital in Brazil, in the big data department as a consulting physician for AI. So I don't work just with imaging, but my main focus is imaging. We also have a project with the Brazilian public health system to build huge data sets from the public hospitals together with our hospital. So nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for coming, Eduardo. Another new entry all the way from India. Many of you will know him. He's a legend in his own right. It's Dr. Vidur Mahajan. Do you want to give a brief intro, Vidur? I know you could talk for hours about yourself, but keep it short.
I know, it's very hard to stop me. So thanks so much, Hugh, Matt, Amy, all of you all for having me. I'm a big Amy fan, and it's just an honor to be here today. So I run Mahajan Imaging, which is my family business. It's a chain of medical imaging centers here in New Delhi. But I spend, in reality, that's supposed to be my day job, but in reality, I spend about 80% of my time running Caring, which is the Center for Advanced Research in Imaging, Neurosciences, and Genomics, where I run a next generation sequencing lab and also a medical imaging AI, I don't even know what to call it, like translational lab, where we essentially build software to help develop, test, and deploy AI in the medical domain. So a lot of our work revolves around figuring out ways of testing AI in clinical kind of formats, right? So, and our engineering team sits in reading rooms, which gives them, a unique kind of perspective, and we try to reflect that in the work that we do. Had the honor of partnering with Karley and her team early on in Caring's days. And yeah, now have fun working all over the world. So thanks again for having me.
Brilliant, thank you, Vidur. And last but not least, it doesn't really need much intro. It's the king of Australian AI, Dr. Luke Oakden-Rayner.
Yeah, hi. I'm
are you PhD?
definitely
Are you PhD yet? Are you PhD yet, Luke? Was that pending?
Close. Yeah, so I'm here, I guess, this week representing Australia and New Zealand. I'm on the AI working group for the Royal Australian College here. And mostly I'll be listening to people's experiences in other parts of the globe.
Brilliant. So my first question for the panel, which part of the world, and let's talk countries rather than continents or hemispheres, which country in the world do we think is ahead in terms of actual clinical use and deployment of artificial intelligence in medicine in general, maybe not just in radiology? Who do you think's ahead? I know I've got an idea, but I'm testing the panel. See if they agree.
I think, how do you define AI, Hugh?
Okay, that's okay. That's what Luke normally says at the start of each thing. How do we define AI? Let's take it as, you know, a system which is using the new paradigm of artificial intelligence, deep learning, 2014 onwards, that kind of technology. Where in the world do you think is it most deployed in quantity?
I think at least if one is to go by the hype, it would be China, right? We're seeing a lot of companies, you know, we've seen a lot of ultrasound companies embedding like automated segmentation, you know, UNet kind of stuff on ultrasound machines, and just selling them like, and not making a big hoopla about it. You know, they're just like, you know, things that make the radiologist's job easier. And other than that, also, I think during COVID, there was initially a lack of RT-PCR kits to diagnose COVID. So, you know, we've all heard the stories about, you know, Luke wrote a brilliant paper on that as well. And about using CT to, you know, quote unquote, diagnose COVID-19 and then adding a layer of AI on it to make it happen like really fast. I guess the government pushes AI there as well. Again, that's hearsay. Would have been awesome to have someone from China though. But I would say China, and then from what I've heard, India, right? Also, because a lot of the tuberculosis screening pilots are going on, but it would be fair to say that there are tens of thousands of studies being read in India every day using some form of AI, whether it's a quality check or you know, if it's just like a normal versus abnormal kind of thing. But yeah, that's what comes to mind, at least it's my mind.
I'll echo Vidur here that it would have been great to have someone with on the ground experience in China on here, because the real trouble with China, I wrote a blog post about some research that came out of China about a year ago, which is really good research. The problem with China is we get very little news compared to, say, the US and Europe. That, you know, you don't get your PR releases when new models come out in Western media, and so you know there's lots of money going into it. You know there's lots of teams working on it. You know that those teams often have better access to data and clinics than we might in the West, but we don't actually have a very good understanding of what's happening on the ground, whether that's actually being put into practice, whether it's being used, and how far along that translation path they are. So yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like China as well is going to be pushing very far forward here. Certainly agree about India. A lot of research has come out of Singapore, and a fair bit has been done in Africa as well. So there is work being done across those regions, particularly I think Uganda and Kenya perhaps. And I don't think we should discount the US as well. That, you know, the US has an enormous amount of money going into this, an enormous amount of sort of brain drain towards the US, and really we have over 50 FDA approvals. So quite a bit is actually getting put into practice now. You know, we've recently seen the CMS decision of Medicare reimbursing AI, and that system was already in place in many, many hospitals across the US. So, and also for Karley, I mean, GE and companies like that are embedding AI as we speak into scanners, and it's happening at the back end. So that's all over the world.
Yep.
I think
Vidur.
Karley, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I almost, when I think about where the innovation is originating from, I think Vidur and Luke painted a really good map of it. Where it's being adopted most readily, the lens I would actually put on it is less geographical and more bandwidth to have dedicated teams to work on first of a kind custom plumbing, to like work with 7 different startups or work with AI being invented at home. And so that first level of adoption in clinical practice, to me, actually, as I think about, you know, the global scale of partners that we have, has less to do with a certain geography being out in front and more to do with maybe an academic institution with the resources, both in terms of dollars and people, to actually ingest this AI. And so I think when you think about the broader adoption, we have a long way to go as industry and clinical research partners to make it easier to work with AI at scale.
I'm just going to pause the thread and introduce, sorry, you may have noticed on camera, we have our sixth attendee, Joseph Cohen, is a postdoc. He's joined us from Canada. So now we're completing our global map pretty much. Joseph, do you want to give just a 1 minute brief intro to yourself for the audience who may not know?
Yeah, so hello, Joseph Paul Cohen. I'm a postdoc at AIMI. Before that, I was a postdoc at Mila. My background is computer vision, health, with a good portion of genomics as well as medical imaging. And I think a relevant fact for this is my work on Chester, which was like an open source, globally deployable chest X-ray analysis platform that was free and open source and distributed computing to scale. Yeah, so that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joseph. Going back to the thread, I think China is the right answer. I was part of a team and we did a systematic review of all the prospective studies that have been done with AI. And I think it was 6 out of 8 at the time we did it were from China. And they weren't on radiology, they were on video colonoscopy and similar procedures. So China certainly was ahead in terms of doing the research. And Luke's right, we might not necessarily see the press releases and the hype side of it, but we certainly see the academic side. The Chinese are very good at getting their publications out there. So I think the panel is pretty much unanimous that China is probably the spearhead, but don't discount the rest of the world. And I wanted to go back to India, Vidur. I think you touched on tuberculosis. I get the impression that, and as Karley mentioned, it may not be so much geographical, but more to do with funding, resource, and the desire to actually have it in practice. And you mentioned something just before we came on air about, there's a saying that people often say about India or similar parts of the world that are developing where, well, something's better than nothing. And you say, well, actually, there isn't nothing. It's just not a first world type system per se. So did you want to sort of expand on that and then talk to us what you know about what's happening in India, sort of maybe in the more rural areas?
So thanks for bringing that up, Hugh. Personally, I feel quite strongly about this statement because, if you go to any big public hospital, so public implying government hospital in India, it's an unfortunate truth that almost like all radiographs would not be read by radiologists or maybe read by radiology residents if requested. Several it's a common narrative to say that, okay, if we give AI there, at least we're giving them something, right? Right now, there's no report, but there will be some report. But the way I look at it is that they may be unreported X-rays, but they're not unactioned X-rays, right? In the sense that there is a clinician who's looking at the X-ray, or there is a pulmonologist that's looking at the X-ray. There is, or if it's a fracture, there's an orthopedic surgeon looking at the X-ray, and he probably does a better job than a radiologist who sees much lesser of those X-rays. So I think always when we're looking at deploying these solutions, we have to measure against status quo and not against the ideal of what one expects. On the tuberculosis side, certainly there is a push. So in the pre-COVID era, our Prime Minister had given this like relatively crazy goal. Oh, awesome! I didn't know you could do that. Awesome. So
very clever.
Very clever. So yeah, we kind of set this big, hairy, audacious goal of eliminating tuberculosis by 2025, and the Gates Foundation funded a bunch of that work and all of that. And as part of that, there was a significant amount of charitable money that went into screening for tuberculosis. And the most common way of screening for tuberculosis today in India is the Mantu test, right, which invariably everyone has positive because we are all exposed at some point. So then, they go to X-ray. And in fact, about 30 years ago, 35 years ago, there used to be mass miniature radiography. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that concept, but literally people would line up and there would be x-rays taken, and these would be, like really small films that a radiologist would very quickly sift through. And taking that concept to tuberculosis screening today using AI is proving to be quite good, at least from a normal versus abnormal perspective, because, as we know, at least now algorithms are fairly good at discerning normal versus abnormal. And then the abnormals go in for a sputum test or something like that. So this is a reality. It's not everywhere. It's not omnipresent. One, for lack of money, like, patients aren't really paying for this stuff. And a chest x-ray in New Delhi, like you can get a chest x-ray from a decent diagnostic facility for as low as $1. Right, and you'll get a film, you'll get a report. They might even WhatsApp the X-ray to you if you ask them nicely. So I think those are the that's where we are today. But adoption is increasing. Just there's this amazing article came out yesterday in the New York Times about Cure.ai's deployments, and I think that's telling in itself. So bright days ahead. We're very excited. And internet penetration is huge in India now. So that just helps drive, a lot of the AI as well.
So it seems to me what you're slightly saying there is that perhaps it's the radiologists and the doctors in the Western world who are the barrier to AI adoption, whereas in India, they aren't actually doing that job already, so there's no barrier to try and overcome.
No, I don't think so, because, the question of liability still remains, right? You may be just transferring liability from the radiologist to the physician, but what happens if a physician screws up because the AI gave a wrong, report? So that question still very much remains, and I draw parallels with the world of lab medicine and pathology. Because there you put in blood, you get out a number, but in India you still have a pathologist sign under that number, even if it's a biochemistry test. So there is that liability question always there, which is why no report is sometimes better than a bad report, right? Because like in no report there's no liability, but in a bad report there is liability. So yeah, so that's a bit of a nuance, and which is why all these things like again AIMI's work on clicking photographs using mobile phones and processing X-rays and all, it's amazing, but it has to be addressed to physicians and then solve their problem. So, but like I said, very early days, next 2 to 3 years are going to be really telling in terms of how this pans out.
So, Vidur, I have a question regarding TB and what you said about don't having radiologists and the AI is better than nothing. So, one of the things that because Brazil is one of the countries for stopping TB project, we also here have some investment on screening with AI. We have a project related to that. And one of the challenges that experts in TB said to us is that many of the clinicians looking at those imaging, when they don't are very confident with their decision, they actually see more things than that are in the imaging. So they are treating more people than they should, and many people engaging in those treatments that will be like 6 months, 1 year. So it's a huge problem. So when they told us about this problem, they like that the AI model kind of tried to address that thing. So do you think that this is a problem that you?
It certainly is, and I don't know how exactly AI can help in that, because in a TB endemic area like in India, if anybody goes to an orthopedic surgeon with a upper thoracic, like a backache, essentially the first thing that comes to mind is maybe it's pot spine or something like that. So which is, like I'm sure like Luke and Hugh, like you guys would never think of that as your first diagnosis. So, so again, it's bias with logic maybe, or experience behind it. But you're right. And then, if you're looking for a finding on an X-ray, and if it's not a good X-ray, you probably will find it anyway. So how can AI help you reduce false positives? I don't know the answer. But again, the thing is, the question in the clinician's mind is not, is it TB or is it not TB? It's, should I treat it or not? Right. So, and that's, that's one paper that, we've been conceptualizing for 3 years, not figured out how to do it. But how do you see if AI actually helps me treat better than actually diagnose better? And very difficult thing to, think through. But yeah, that's kind of where we're stuck right now. Yeah.
Can I just, like, this discussion's super interesting, and one of the things that jumps out at me is there's this kind of hidden layer behind something is better than nothing, which is that there's this almost imperialistic view in the West that you can just send AI to places that don't have very much when you haven't tested it well enough yet. And that's not the case, say, in India, where you're producing locally systems that fit your demands. But we do see, European and US AI companies testing their products in jurisdictions with less control than other jurisdictions. And while there's some reality to the statement, sure, if there's truly nothing there, improving access is a big deal for people in the developing world. But since these systems can roll out so wide, say a tuberculosis screening program, since they can roll out so wide, you can get a small increase in false positives, for example. The system that isn't even meant to decide if it's TB or not, it's just deciding if it's an abnormal scan or not. That system could have a flow-on effect through the healthcare network that suddenly massively expands the number of patients that are being treated. And that could have a huge flow-on impact to the population and to the healthcare system of that country, even though the system itself is doing something that may not be readily available. It can have these huge flow-on effects. And there's this kind of idea that, because people don't have good access itself is a good enough reason to provide AI systems in Africa and India and so on. But it's not necessarily true. And in some ways, it might even be more dangerous than what we see in, say, the US, where you have these individual companies or individual academic institutions that are trialing stuff in much more limited ways than may happen if a government-funded program for, say, TB screening happens more broadly.
It is really fascinating, isn't it? And I was going to ask Karley, because GE is obviously trying to deploy things globally. Surely the same algorithm can't be deployed in India and China, Brazil, Canada, US, and Australia, can it?
It certainly depends what problem you're trying to solve. So, I mean, I think Luke's point is spot on. And one of the phrases that jumped to mind for me is, you only get one first impression. And I think one of the worst things we can do for the adoption of AI is push it and test it in places where we don't think people are watching, or we don't think the rules matter as much. First of all, I could talk about the ethics of that type of decision making, but also if you're thinking about the rolling out across many geographies, that I think that's one of the quickest ways to lose trust in AI. So, Hugh, though, to your comment, yes, we build global products, but that requires building AI with global data, tested at a global scale, modified to the workflow of a global workforce. So there's a paradigm that we think about, which is helpful internally when we work with folks about like upstream and downstream AI. Upstream AI, and I know you and Dr. Topol just wrote a brief perspective piece about this, but upstream AI is all about how do we create better data itself, leveraging AI in the reconstruction process to create data cheaper, faster, better, lower dose, all of these kind of gold standards. That is fairly straightforward to generalize across geographies because it's the creation of data self-contained within a closed system of a device. When you talk about the decision-making, or what we call the downstream AI, where you're acting upon the data that's created, you have to think through the ripple effects of that much more methodically and carefully about both the workflow of a given geography and the regulatory parameters of a given geography. Vidur mentioned an early model that we actually partnered with him and his team on around pneumothorax, which we've embedded inside our X-ray. We built that model with data from 3 different continents with the clinical partnership from partners around the world for this specific reason, because it breaks every paradigm of deep learning if you think you can build with one type of data and deploy in a way that generalizes. You know, the keys we talk about are like volume, variety, veracity. Volume, no one argues about. Variety, a lot of people argue about. If you want a model that works in India, you better create a model from folks who live in India. In the development of that model, one of the things that we found was we had built a first early stage model. We ran it in India. We kept getting all these false positives. It was because the field of view was further back, and it was picking up the space between the arm and the chest cavity. And these are the kind of, you're not going to catch all of these, but you have to get a model to generalize to a certain extent, and then put the bounds around it within the problem that you're solving so that you don't create artificial trust in a system. So I do think that upstream and downstream construct is a helpful framework for thinking about where AI can maybe accelerate the fastest, and where I think there's going to be real important regional ecosystems that start to emerge around this more downstream space. And it's why at GE we've invested so much in our Edison platform, because in a lot of ways we see our role in this downstream space, if you look 5 years forward, as being the roads and bridges for data and AI to flow. But it's going to be specific to a region of the world and a developer ecosystem specific to those regions. So I think there's a lot probably to unpack there, but I'm curious what other folks think about that general framing.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think I have two points I wanted to bring up here. So for generalization, right, I would ask the question, how do doctors from the US and Canada, right, generalize to India, right? Because a doctor who's trained in the US can read a chest X-ray from Indian hospital, I assume. There's got to be, you know, pieces of I think the treatment varies and what you're going to do and the whole ecosystem that it is in, but the measurement is similar, right? So I think that's one point that I would want to discuss, because I think that there's something in if we have to get data from everywhere in the world in order to make these algorithms work everywhere in the world, doctors aren't trained that way, so there's some that can't be. I don't think that has to be true if doctors are able to overcome this, right? Which means that we just have to further perfect the algorithm to better emulate us, and then it would generalize there. And then another point that goes back maybe a minute is why I feel like we're discussing aiming for specific systems that aim in specific areas. I forgot that maybe I'm reading the discussion a little bit too wrong, but if you have a system for India and a system for the US and Canada, right? Why wouldn't we just aim for the perfect system for everyone, right? Because in the long run, we're all going to be, every place is going to be identical, right? Like that there's going to be one way, you know, or like a variety of ways that people choose to live in a once we all get to that point of where no one's disadvantaged anymore, right? And everyone
never underestimate the UK's ability to separate itself from the rest of the world. So I agree with your point entirely. I just know that the country I live in just like to go, no, we can do it our way, it's fine. But yes, sorry, carry on.
Oh, I guess I used to, I like to think about that when I think about building solutions that we should have, because if you build a solution for another country, it is somehow not equal to yours. I consider the US a developing country, just like everyone else, right? Like how is it so different? Like healthcare is also a challenge, right? Maybe the specific diseases may vary, but the infrastructure for all of that may, we should be the same. We should be heading towards that perfect solution that's going to work for everyone, and not just like a solution for every country, because at that point, then you're just solidifying the separation between everyone, right?
Yeah, in my point of view, most of my concerns regarding this is related with disease distribution. But there are other diseases that are is everywhere. Those are you don't have this problem of distribution, but we as learning individuals, when we for example goes from the US to India, you just say to a radiologist, oh, here you have TB, so when you find a cavity or when you find a consolidation or anything, and this kind of group of people, you think about TB, and then we learn. Unfortunately, we are not able yet to do that with the algorithms, but maybe one day.
Are you talking about the baseline prevalence? The issue of just the underlying prevalence of the disease is changing, so you have to like this prior bias where you expect to see tuberculosis, therefore when in doubt, you just you're not sure, and you say, well, on average, the statistics show is as likely a TB case if the 20 other patients before them were.
Luke.
Yeah. Look, in an ideal world, that's how it would work. That you can just add a bias to the TB diagnosis when you go to India, and you say, you shift the threshold and say that as long as it's over a very low level, we'll consider TB as a diagnosis, and that's how it would work ideally. But the problem, we discuss this a lot on this show, is that these systems are very much, they don't just learn distributions, they learn features, and the features they see are very different in different locations. So if you don't ever see TB in a training data set, then almost every cavitating lesion is going to be cancer. And that's a very different process, a very different path than thinking about infectious disease lesions, for example. And just saying that, oh, it could be cancer or TB is not even making the right distinctions anymore. They're very different processes if you're on the ground in India, and the feature sets are different. It's never had the chance to learn the difference between those features. I think the other thing is that, yes, in an ideal world, we'd all be pushing towards a perfect solution for everybody. But we have a very different reality on the ground. And, in lots of the world, we're looking at hard copy film imaging, for example, for X-ray. And a system that is trained on digital imaging is not going to perform even vaguely on hard copy film imaging, even if it's digitized hard copy film imaging. I've seen some examples of systems that are used, you can take a smartphone picture of a hard copy film to try and diagnose that film. Only a system trained on that exact type of data will be able to perform on that type of data. In the developing world, we often have secondhand scanners being sold. So you might still have a 4-slice CT scanner, for example. You might still have system running old software, such as old reconstructions techniques and so on. And these images will inherently look very different than the images that a top of the line academic institution in the US will be training on. And those differences seem to be incredibly important. Things that aren't meaningful to humans, but make the images visually different, can make a huge difference in what gets seen. There are all these papers in the machine learning literature about how important texture features are, for example, in doing classification tasks. And humans don't rely on texture features for almost anything. So we've got this really big distinction between what AI and what humans do in practice. AI systems rely on features that humans don't use, and humans get to ignore them. And it just means that the difference in workflow and deployment infrastructure on the ground is massively important. We can't ignore that. So as things stand at the moment, I think it's unreasonable to say we can get to a perfect world where everyone does the same thing. You'd have to spend trillions of dollars getting the technology level up to the same standard across the world. And then that gets updated every couple of years anyway. So you'd have to spend trillions more. And that money just doesn't exist. So I think we can aim for that, but you do need to be aware that there are significant differences.
So on the differences, one of the things that I wanted to bring up to the panel was clearly a lot of us have said, whether we're aiming for this perfect universal globalized system or we're aiming to deploy locally, either way, we need to train on local data, or as much data as we can from as broad a spectrum of geographies as possible. So in the panel's experience, what's the difference in the availability of data? Oh, Joseph disagrees. I love how you're doing that, by the way. What's your experience as a panel about the availability of data? And perhaps, I know, Eduardo and Vidur want to start off on this. And certainly it's my experience in the UK. Getting blood out of a stone is the phrase that's often used for getting data from the NHS. What's it like getting data, in your local jurisdictions?
Yeah, like any good answer, right? It depends on what you're looking for and what level of granularity you're working on. Like, we end up helping a lot of AI companies and even big companies across the world getting their hands on some kind of data. And now we have like data pipes from across the world, and it then generally comes down to the data request, right? If you want, if the data request is send me 10,000 again, chest X-rays with pneumonia, versus the data request is send me 500 mammograms that are ER/PR positive, HER2 negative with their genomic profiling, with whatever that's a relatively more difficult task. So it's a spectrum, and I imagine that the spectrum exists everywhere. Of course, there are hospitals that are privileged in the sense that they have integrated EMR systems and all of that. So that makes it easier. The one challenge that we face, at least in India, that that logically one would assume may not be faced in places like the UK and US at least, is that India operates on a marketplace healthcare model. So what that means is patients pay out of pocket for almost everything. So that means that I may be going to hospital A for my MRI, and hospital B for my CT scan, and hospital C for my X-ray, and then hospital D to get operated on. So there is no continuum of data in terms of data storage, except for the patient, right? So as a patient in India, I am given all of my data generally, right? In the big cities, I'm given all of my data on CDs or even pen drives, and now Google Drive, right? So that's the challenge that we face, right? It's generally, if you want just image with label, easy. If you want follow-up images with label, very difficult. And if you want follow-up images with labels across different departments, then there's just a huge challenge on that. So but I guess that's fairly standard across the world. I would assume that pathology departments talking to radiology departments anywhere in the world would be, I don't think, very easy.
Eduardo, how about in Brazil?
Oh, yeah. So we are trying to address a challenge in this for public hospitals here in Brazil. So in Brazil, we have a universal public health system. So every citizen has access and they can go to a public hospital. But most of the health are like in India, people pay out of their pocket. So we have both systems, and we just see this huge opportunity for this centralized healthcare system, that you have many sites where you can contribute to make a huge data set, a huge repository for training algorithms on that specific setting, because the machines will be older, the chest X-rays will be analogic. You need that data set and this storage of imaging. So you have this huge opportunity and a big challenge, because it's very sad, because many of those hospitals, most of them, just erase their HD when they are full, and you just lost all of those data that you could use to train ML and everything. And you have all of these disparities of realities. You have many high-level hospitals like ours. You have the better machines and the high-quality imaging, and you have those hospitals with older machines, less quality imaging, and that's a challenge, these disparities, and we are trying to address that.
I was going to ask both for Vidur and Eduardo, the biggest barrier in US, UK, Australia, and so on is often not, is the data available, because the system's less fragmented than what you're describing. But the barrier is often one of healthcare governance and data privacy and data security, that a lot of organizations are unwilling to share their data with a commercial organization, for example. And sometimes that means that you need to jump through hoops to get it, and that takes sometimes years. Sometimes it means groups need to pay for access to data. I just wonder what it seems like in Brazil and India. Is data for a random startup, just a startup that's reasonably well funded, has a decent name, if they go to a hospital network and say, we'd like to partner for some data, how does that actually happen? Do they just convince them that they're good enough? Do they need to pay for it? How is this, is the same barrier in place there? Or is it just that as long as you can show that you're going to be secure with your data, that you're willing to share it?
So I can go first. The first question generally most hospital systems ask, and I think now they've got it figured out, is this even legal? Right? Can I do this? Because we're lucky we've been taking consent at our institution, but most places around the world don't take consent from patients at the time of performing the imaging study, that their data may be shared for research purposes and stuff like that. But now I think the jury is out that anonymized data that can not be re-identified is fine to be licensed or shared or whatever. So that's generally the first step, and then the second step is how much effort is it for me to pull out this data, right? Because if it's going to be my IT guy sitting with my radiologist, filtering through my scans, and maybe Karley can talk for hours on this, but if it's going to be the hospital people putting in their time and effort into pulling out the data, then certainly that's another barrier. But people are fairly okay. Like, there's a bunch of AI startups in India now. Most folks who rely on retrospective data do get their hands on some, and then it's just a matter of proving to the hospital or the imaging service provider that you know what you're talking about, and it's actually worth working with you. So it's I think the big hospitals in India have it figured out. People are talking data for equity and stuff like that as well. So it's becoming fairly mature, I would say.
Karley,
yeah.
do you want to tell us? Sorry, Eduardo. Karley, I've been wanting to ask. You said earlier that GE gets data sets from around the world.
Sure.
And
Sure.
GE is
So
obviously
before I jump into that, I'll be a little bit glib, but I have the chance to work with startups around the globe, maybe almost as many as Hugh. But when people ask me like, what are the most important roles to have within our team? Like, number one, get yourself ahead of product. Otherwise, you're going to create AI that no one wants. Number two, get yourself ahead of regulatory. Otherwise, you're going to create AI that no one can use. Number three, get yourself ahead of data. Otherwise, you're not going to create AI. And the reality is that like the volume of data that we all want is never going to materialize. And so how do you set up your own parameters and platforms and systems to optimize the value of data with the volumes that are at your disposal? Again, back to what I said, when we think of the 3 ingredients you need to create a model that works at a global scale: volume, variety, veracity. Volume, you've got to hit a threshold, but we're just not in a place in the healthcare spectrum where you're going to build a model on the billions of data that the GPT-3, the NLPs in our AI space get the benefit of, right? The variety, that doesn't mean that if you can hit that threshold from one country, check, you're good. You've got to get it from enough different places. The veracity, how you annotate that data though, can make up for a huge amount of this volume debate, because if you are able to annotate your data with enough specificity, with enough granularity, you can really still build extremely high performing AI. But the key is anyone can do that with an unlimited time and money. The key is to build systems and platforms that allow you to do that type of annotation curation work with as much efficiency as possible. And so, I'm fortunate to be at GE where, we work in 160 countries. We create 16,000 scans a minute at a global scale. And we have partnerships with folks all around the world. Not all partnerships look the same, and they shouldn't. You kind of have to deal with the human and motivation element behind it. But I do think it's really important when we're talking about this data question to not just think like, hey, there's a magic volume threshold that if we can go achieve out there, we can build like the one AI to rule them all.
So you kind of avoided the question, but I did enjoy your answer. I won't press you again.
Hugh, I have a question.
We'll see how much time we have, Hugh. I'll let you play it.
Hugh, I have a quick question for the panel, right? Especially the ML practitioners, which I think is every one of you. How long do you think, in terms of algorithm development, are we actually going to need as much data as we're all talking about, right? So, for example, right, there's few short learning, N of 1 learning, N of 0 learning. I don't know. There was an article about it, something. So like you can train without data. That was the headline. So how far out is the day when literally you give a textbook to an algorithm and the algorithm knows how to read an X-ray or an MRI or something like that? Because Hugh and Luke and Eduardo have not seen millions of examples of everything that is possible and all of that, but still they know how to read scans. So how far will we even need data like 5 years into the future or 10 years into the future?
Eduardo, do you want to take that one?
Oh,
and then Joseph
I can start, but I'm curious about the other views. Yeah, first of all, I think that for now we are kind of building computer vision algorithms, and when you talk about that, it's kind of more about a generalizable system that can understand, and the language is a key point, a key feature of this. I would be I'm very curious to see a few shot learning algorithm for imaging, like you said. But I think that in GPT-3, for example, you have a huge component of this thing that we use for communicate and to understand a word that is language, and in the imaging, you just kind of don't have this this explanation of what you have there. It would be wonderful, but I'm curious to hear the other views about that. Joseph?
Joseph.
Yeah, so I think there's so much open chest X-ray data available now, right? Over 1 million public chest X-ray images, right? And then the labels associated with them are very coarse, right? But also enough to build general models, general features, right? So I think we're here now where we can leverage this, right? In some recent works that we've done using transfer learning, but very simple transfer learning, not even complicated, like just taking features from a model trained on similar related tasks. We can predict like COVID severity scores pretty well, right? On data sets of hundreds, right? And I think one study was like 90 something chest X-rays with scores, and we're able to get like a really good severity prediction, right, of COVID pneumonia. And this is stuff that the model had never seen before. So I think we might be there now, right? I think zero-shot learning, this direction is going to be even better, right? So for that, we define the concepts of the class by attributes, right, that represent that specific new disease, which may be how one radiologist would talk to another radiologist about a disease. They say, oh, you know, it's got some ground glass opacity, and you're going to know something like, you know, in the lower left lung, that's where it's gonna, you know, you're gonna find this feature. So they already kind of explain diseases in terms of attributes. We can, if we train models and curate data like this, even on existing data, we can take advantage of that zero-shot learning to then define diseases based on the characterization of the attributes of those diseases, right? But I think that's specifically there for chest X-ray. We're not there for CT scans, for PET scans, for other things that there's just not enough data. So that stuff's far off. But I say we're here now, we're there now, where we have enough just raw data, and we need really precisely annotated data to move forward. So I feel like in my discussions over time with people in medical AI, these physicians say we have 50 patients and we have tons of data for those 50 patients. So from like training a neural network, this is not the right, the dimensionality is wrong, right? But now then we move forward to having, you know, a really large N with a few number of features, which is great. So then now we can go back to very densely labeled, annotated for a few patients.
So a couple of people here have mentioned that we're going to be moving from this high volume of data paradigm to a highly granular and precision annotated data. And this might help, you know, some of the problems that we're having with producing models that are generalizable, robust, and can adapt. So I want to bring us back into the global theme of tonight's show, and this is to a point that Luke wanted to raise, is with all this labeling, who's going to do it? And there's a concept of research or task offshoring, whereby you use cheaper labor in different countries to do some of either the labeling or the actual training of the algorithm, or even some of the product management and software development. And this is obviously a global phenomenon in many industries, not just AI. But I wonder if anyone had anything they could speak to in their experiences of any of this happening.
I can certainly speak to companies doing that. I mean, there are a number of companies I'm aware of that use cheaper radiologists, for example, in other countries to label data. I don't think there's necessarily a problem with that. One issue would be, there's this idea that Joseph has raised in some of his work of concept shift, that different jurisdictions report things differently. And if you rely on radiologists from a certain part of the world, you will get idiosyncratic reporting behavior from that part of the world, unless you train them to do otherwise. So you just have to be aware of that. Usually when people are labeling data, they design their labeling scheme from the ground up if they're doing it well, and they train people to do that. So I don't think that's a major issue. I mean, we've already talked a bit more already about the larger ethical concern of offshoring, which is doing the testing in a place that doesn't require us to do very good testing. But labeling and so on, I guess there is an ethical question of whether it's exploitative. The whole mechanical Turk ImageNet idea of getting people from other parts of the world to annotate images for cents when it would cost dollars in another country. There's a question of exploitation there, but we've got a globalized workforce, and if they're being paid well by their local standards, I'm not sure I see a problem with that. I'm not sure what the rest of the panel thinks.
Yeah, we work with annotation partners all over the globe. I will say that kind of the implicit in the question was maybe there'd be lower quality based on certain lower paid regions. That has not been our finding, at all. And what we've worked really hard to do is put systems and controls in place to have that really high quality, multiple radiologists reviewing each other's work. Once you run the algorithm, re-seeing what are the trends and why things are missed, go back and look at those type of, so you create those systems. I think for me, it's the quality of the outputs and the consistency of approach that if you leave to human nature, you're not going to be able to standardize, but is something that we've seen people in all kinds of industries create standards about. So we actually think one of our strengths is partnerships at a kind of a global scale.
And the last question I've got for the panel.
Sorry,
Joseph, just before my last question, yes, of course.
So Karley, I think, are you kind of alluding to a assembled in situation, just like with Apple, where the... So
yeah, I can, this is public, I can be more explicit about it. For example, if we're building a model, we'll have all of the data uploaded into what's our Edison platform. We'll have radiologists. I'll use an example I talked about before, our first FDA cleared X-ray that was embedded in device. We had radiologists from 3 different continents logging in, working within workflows in order to do those annotation tasks, and then being able to QC each other based on platforming that had been built out. And so that work, happened at a global scale, and with really high quality and brilliant partners all around the world.
So who becomes the authority in that case? Like, what is the truth when you have multiple collaborators from different countries? Is there a radiologist in the US that is the authority for that system, saying this is what this concept means? Right?
Yeah, great question. So this is why hiring that head of regulatory is so important. Almost every regulatory body, if you want to have a product cleared for a region, requires the ground truthing to be done by radiologists, medical experts of that region. So for an FDA clearance, yes, the data set that we will use as the final test to do an FDA submission will be done by American radiologists, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, but so you have it agreed upon by radiologists in every region, so you can use the same model everywhere? Is that how you would get? So if you need a radiologist from each region to approve all of the labels and the training that was happening there, but you only want to train one model, all those radiologists then just need to agree on all the data, and then you can use that same model for approval.
Yeah, it's not a mini scoped network. There's like certain controls and quality review going on of those annotators. So it's not like you need every site coalescing. We have an internal GE team that kind of works across multiple sites. But then what I was getting at is the final set of data that we use for a regulatory clearance would have been done by radiologists in a specific region. So just the training set versus the validation or submission set. So the building of the training set, we will leverage the power of like a global partnership, but the building of a final FDA submission or CE submission, et cetera, validation set is done based on whatever rules and regulations of a specific region.
Okay, so the validation sets vary between countries, but the training set is one massive pool of data. Okay.
That's right. Yep.
Cool.
Excellent. Well, we've reached the top of the hour, and I feel like we've barely even sort of scratched the surface on this. I think I'm just going to sort of very briefly wrap up, because I know that we've run out of time. And the thing I wanted to summarize was, I really like this idea of heading towards some kind of globalized standard way of doing things. And I like to take bigger picture views on things. And I like to imagine, like, if we are going to build, it's going to sound crazy, by the way, if we are going to go to Mars, like Elon Musk wants us to do, what hospital would we put on Mars, and what processes would we put in that hospital? It's kind of the way I think of it if we think about the future of what we want to do on Earth. That's what we kind of need to be aiming for. And it needs to be suitable for whoever we're sending up there. So it needs to be trained on a wide variety of data for that. But I want to just thank everybody around the world for joining this, especially Vidur, because it's like 3 a.m. or something silly for him.
Perfectly fine.
Luke for waking up so early on his Saturday morning for you, is that correct?
Morning, yeah.
Excellent. And Eduardo and Joseph, it's been a pleasure to meet you, and I hope to catch you face to face. It's a shame RSNA is not happening face to face this year in the next few weeks, but I'm sure we'll catch up together soon. So thank you very much for watching. This is going to be on YouTube live, uploaded, I think, within an hour or so after we've finished. So feel free to rewatch and share, and we will catch you roughly in a month's time for the last one of this year. But this has been Stanford AIMI Happy Hour for this week. Goodbye.